The envelope was hidden behind our wedding photo on the mantelpiece. I found it 3 days after I told my daughter Sarah that no, I would not be moving into Sunset Gardens assisted living, and no, I didn't care how many brochures she'd collected or how many times she'd driven past to check out their amenities. I'd been dusting the mantel, something Ruth used to do every Saturday morning while humming old hymns. The wedding photo had always been her favorite, not because we looked particularly good in it, but because, as she used to say, we looked like people who had no idea what they were getting themselves into. She was right about that. When I lifted the frame to clean underneath, I felt something crinkle against the back. Taped there was a cream-colored envelope, sealed with wax the way Ruth used to do for special occasions. Written across the front in her careful schoolteacher handwriting were words that made me sit down hard in my recliner. For Frank, open only if the children try to put you somewhere you don't want to be. Ruth had been gone for 8 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days. Pancreatic cancer, quick and merciless, the kind that takes people before they're ready to go, before anyone's ready to let them go. In all that time, I'd thought I'd found everything she'd left for me. But this was different. This wasn't about maintaining traditions. This was about something she'd seen coming that I hadn't. I turned the envelope over in my hands, feeling its weight. Not heavy, but substantial, important. The wax seal bore the impression of her grandmother's signet ring. She'd used it to seal letters when she wanted the person opening them to understand that what was inside mattered. I thought about the conversation I'd had with Sarah 3 days earlier, how she'd shown up with her husband Mike and a manila folder full of research, how she'd sat across from me at the kitchen table and explained, in the patient tone she used with her teenage children, that it was time to think realistically about my future. "Dad," she'd said, "you're 72 years old. This house is too big for you. The yard is too much work. What happens if you fall and no one's around to help?" I told her what happens is that I'd get up, assuming I was able to get up. If I wasn't able to get up, then I'd deal with that when it happened. Sarah had exchanged that look with Mike, the look that said they'd discussed this conversation beforehand and prepared their counter-arguments. Mike had shown me floor plans and photographs of apartments with grab bars and emergency pull cords. He'd talked about meal plans and activity calendars and medical staff on site. It all sounded very reasonable, very practical, very much like a place where you went to stop living and start waiting to die. I'd thanked them for their concern and told them I wasn't interested. That's when Sarah had gotten that tone. "Dad," she'd said, "you're not being realistic. Mom's been gone 8 months. You barely leave this house. You eat frozen dinners and watch television all day. That's not living, that's just existing." I'd wanted to tell her that there was a difference between solitude and loneliness, between quiet and empty. But I could see in her face that she'd already decided what my life looked like, and no explanation from me was going to change her mind. I told them I'd think about it, which was what you say when you want people to leave your house and you don't want to argue anymore. After they'd gone, I'd sat in my recliner and looked around the living room. Ruth and I had furnished over 47 years of marriage. The couch where we'd watched every episode of Mass H together, the bookshelf filled with novels she'd read, the coffee table with ring stains from 47 years of morning coffee. It was ours in a way that no apartment in Sunset Gardens could ever be. Now, holding Ruth's envelope, I understood that she'd known this moment would come. She'd seen something in Sarah, or maybe just seen something in the nature of adult children and aging parents that had made her prepare for exactly this conversation. The wax seal broke easily. Inside was a single sheet of Ruth's good stationery, folded around something heavier. I unfolded the letter first. "My dearest Frank," it began, "if you're reading this, then Sarah has decided you can't take care of yourself anymore. She's probably shown you brochures for places with names like Sunset Gardens or Golden Years Manor, places that are designed to sound like vacation destinations instead of warehouses for people whose families have run out of patience with them." I had to stop reading. Even from beyond the grave, Ruth could cut right to the heart of things with a precision that was both comforting and unsettling. I continued reading. "I've watched Sarah over the years, watched the way she organizes her children's lives and Mike's schedule. She's good at managing things, our daughter. But there's a difference between managing a household and managing a human being, and I'm not sure she's learned that difference yet. You are not a problem to be solved, Frank. You are not a burden to be managed or a risk to be minimized. You are a man who has earned the right to live in his own home, surrounded by his own memories, for as long as he chooses to do so." The letter was 2 pages long. She wrote about the difference between caring for someone and controlling them. She wrote about dignity and independence and the courage it takes to choose your own ending. But mostly, she wrote about how real love means trusting someone enough to let them make their own choices, even when those choices worry you. Frank, what I'm about to tell you needs to stay between us until you decide otherwise. I've made some arrangements. Nothing illegal, nothing that will hurt anyone, but things that will give you options if you need them. In my sewing box, in the bottom compartment behind the patterns, you'll find a blue folder. Everything you need to know is in there. Use it if you have to. Don't use it if you don't have to. But know that it's there, and know that I loved you enough to make sure you'd never have to choose between your dignity and your family's peace of mind. Your Ruth. P.S. If you're reading this, you probably need a good meal. There's a casserole in the freezer labeled beef stew for when you need comfort food. Heat it at 350 for 45 minutes. You'll feel better. I sat in my recliner holding Ruth's letter and realized I was crying. Not the hard, desperate crying that had come in the weeks after her funeral, but the soft, grateful crying that comes when you discover that someone you loved understood you better than you understood yourself. Then I remembered what else had been in the envelope. I reached into the cream-colored paper and pulled out a small brass key. Attached to it with a thin piece of ribbon was a small white tag with Ruth's handwriting. For the blue folder, the tag read, "When you're ready." Ruth's sewing box sat in the corner of our bedroom. After she died, I'd closed the lid and left it untouched. Now I opened it for the first time since her funeral. The top compartment held the usual things, but underneath was a false bottom that lifted out to reveal a hidden compartment. Inside was a blue folder, just as she'd promised. I took the folder to the kitchen and spread its contents across the table. What I found made me understand that my wife had been planning for this moment long before she got sick. The first document was a power of attorney. The second was a life insurance policy I'd never known existed, with the beneficiary listed as a trust Ruth had established to ensure that our house would always be maintained. The third document was a letter from Dr. Harrison, dated just 2 months before Ruth's diagnosis, stating that he'd found me to be in good physical and mental health, fully capable of living independently. But it was the fourth document that made me realize just how thoroughly Ruth had anticipated this battle. It was a letter from Sarah herself, written 3 years earlier, telling her mother that she was worried about us and thought we should consider downsizing. Attached to it was Ruth's unsent response, where she'd laid out exactly why Sarah's concerns, while well-meaning, were premature and inappropriate. But the most important part of Ruth's unsent letter was the last paragraph. "Sarah," Ruth had written, "I understand that watching your parents age is frightening. You want to protect us from every possible harm. But protection that requires us to give up our autonomy isn't protection at all. It's imprisonment with good intentions. If the day comes when your father can no longer care for himself, that decision should be his to make, not yours." At the bottom of the blue folder was one more item, a small spiral notebook filled with Ruth's observations about our daily life over the past several years. It was evidence, I realized, documentation that I was living independently and competently. Ruth had been building a case. Not for a court of law, but for the court of family opinion. I sat at the kitchen table surrounded by Ruth's carefully prepared documents and felt something I hadn't felt since before she got sick. I felt protected. Not by someone trying to manage my choices, but by someone who'd worked to ensure I'd always be able to make those choices myself. The phone rang, jarring me out of my thoughts. The caller ID showed Sarah's name. "Dad," she said when I answered, "Mike and I have been talking. We think maybe we were too aggressive." "But Dad," she continued, "we're really worried about you. Maybe we could compromise. What if you stayed in the house, but we looked into getting you some help?" I looked down at Ruth's letter, at the blue folder full of documents that proved I didn't need help. I told Sarah that was very thoughtful, but I was doing fine managing on my own. There was a pause. "Dad," Sarah said, her voice carrying that patient tone again, "we're not trying to control your life. We're trying to help you live it better." I told Sarah that I understood she was worried about me, and I appreciated that she cared, but I was living my life exactly the way I wanted to live it. After I hung up, I realized that this was just the beginning. Sarah wasn't going to give up easily. She was going to keep pushing, keep trying to solve the problem of her 72-year-old father living alone. But now I had something I hadn't had 3 days ago. I had Ruth's preparation, her documentation, her legal arrangements, and most importantly, her perspective on what was really happening here. This wasn't about my safety. This was about Sarah's anxiety. I gathered up Ruth's documents and put them back in the blue folder. But I kept her letter with me, folding it carefully and putting it in my shirt pocket where I could feel its weight against my chest. Tomorrow, Sarah would probably call again, but I was ready now. Ruth had made sure of that. I went to the freezer and found the casserole she'd mentioned in her letter. Beef stew for when you need comfort food. I heated it at 350 degrees for 45 minutes, just as she'd instructed. She was right about that too. I felt better. Sarah called the next morning while I was having my coffee and reading the paper on the back porch. It was one of those October mornings when the air smells like wood smoke and possibility, when you can feel winter thinking about arriving but hasn't made up its mind yet. I let the phone ring 4 times before I answered it. Not because I was avoiding Sarah, but because I was finishing an article about the high school football team, and I'd learned long ago that good news can wait and bad news will find you eventually, no matter how fast you answer the phone. "Morning, Sarah," I said. "Dad, I'm glad I caught you. Are you busy?" "I'm reading the paper and drinking coffee," I told her. "Same thing I do every morning." Good, good. Listen, I wanted to apologize for yesterday. Mike and I talked about it last night and we realized we might have come on a little strong. I waited for the but that was coming. But Dad, we're really concerned about you, and it's not just us. Tommy mentioned to Mike that he's worried too. Tommy was Sarah's oldest son, my grandson, 23 years old and fresh out of college with opinions about everything and experience with nothing. He'd visited me twice since Ruth's funeral, both times looking around the house like he was conducting an inventory. I asked Sarah what exactly Tommy was worried about. "Well," she said, and I could hear her choosing her words carefully, "he said the house looks different than when Grandma was alive. More cluttered. And he noticed you've been wearing the same shirt 2 days in a row." I looked down at the blue flannel shirt I'd put on that morning. It was clean. I'd washed it and dried it and hung it in the closet like I'd been doing my own laundry for the past 8 months. If I'd worn it 2 days ago, it was because it was comfortable and I liked it, not because I was losing track of my personal hygiene. "Sarah," I said, "Tommy visits me maybe once a month for 20 minutes. That's not enough time to assess how I'm managing my life." "I know, Dad, but when family members start expressing concerns—" "Family members," I interrupted, "or family member, because it sounds like you talked to Tommy about me, not like Tommy came to you with concerns." There was a pause. Sarah didn't like being challenged on her logic, probably because her logic was usually sound. But this time she'd overplayed her hand by bringing Tommy into it. "Dad," she said, her voice getting that edge, "it got when she was trying to stay patient. We all care about you. We all want what's best for you." I told Sarah that I appreciated everyone caring about me, but what was best for me was something I was pretty qualified to determine for myself. After we hung up, I went inside and looked at myself in the bathroom mirror. I saw a 72-year-old man who'd lost 20 pounds since his wife died, mostly because he didn't have much appetite. I saw gray hair that needed cutting and a face that looked tired most of the time. But I also saw a man who was shaving regularly and bathing daily and keeping his house clean and paying his bills on time. I saw someone who was managing grief and solitude and the practical challenges of living alone with as much dignity as he could muster. Maybe that wasn't good enough for Sarah and Tommy, but it was good enough for me. I spent the morning working in the garden, pulling up the last of the tomato plants and preparing the beds for winter. It was work Ruth and I used to do together. Now I did both, not because I particularly enjoyed flower gardening, but because letting Ruth's roses go to seed felt like giving up on something important. Around noon, Tom Patterson came over from next door. Tom was my age, maybe a year or two older, and had lived in the house beside ours for 15 years. His wife Helen made the best chocolate chip cookies in the neighborhood. Tom found me in the backyard, wrestling with a particularly stubborn tomato steak. "Need some help with that?" he asked. I told him I had it under control. Tom nodded and stood watching me work. That was Tom's way. He didn't believe in rushing into conversations. "Helen sent me over to ask if you'd like to join us for dinner Sunday," Tom said after I'd gotten the steak loose. "She's making pot roast." I thanked him and said that sounded nice. "She's worried about you," Tom said. "We both are. Not worried like your daughter's worried, but worried like neighbors worry. About whether you're eating enough, sleeping enough, staying connected to people." I appreciated the distinction. Tom understood the difference between concern and control, between caring about someone and trying to manage them. I told Tom I was doing all right. Some days were harder than others, but that was to be expected. "Ruth used to talk to Helen sometimes," Tom said, "about Sarah, about how she meant well but didn't always understand that meaning well isn't the same as helping well." That got my attention. Ruth had never complained to me about Sarah, but apparently she'd shared some concerns with Helen. What kind of things did Ruth say? Tom looked uncomfortable, the way men do when they realize they might be sharing confidences that weren't meant for sharing. Nothing specific, Tom said, just that Sarah had very definite ideas about how things should be done. We worked together for another hour, Tom helping me clear the garden beds. It felt good to have company for the work, to have someone to hand tools to, and someone to hold the other end of things that needed carrying. As we were finishing up, Tom said something that stayed with me for the rest of the day. "Frank," he said, "Helen and I have been married 38 years. One thing we've learned is that the people who love you the most can sometimes be the ones who understand you the least." After Tom left, I went inside and called Dr. Harrison's office to make an appointment for a checkup. Not because I thought I needed one, but because I had a feeling I was going to need recent medical documentation of my physical and mental competency. That evening, I was watching the news when a car pulled into my driveway. Through the living room window, I could see Sarah getting out, but she wasn't alone. She was followed by a woman I didn't recognize, someone in her 40s with a professional-looking clipboard and a manner that suggested she was used to dealing with difficult situations. I opened the door before they could knock. "Dad," Sarah said, "this is Linda Crawford. She's a social worker who specializes in senior care assessments. I asked her to come out and talk with you." Linda stepped forward with a smile that was probably meant to be reassuring, but felt more like the kind of smile you give someone when you're about to deliver news they don't want to hear. "Mr. Mitchell," Linda said, "your daughter is concerned about your well-being. I was hoping we could sit down and talk about some options for making your living situation safer and more sustainable." I looked at Sarah, then at Linda, then back at Sarah. My daughter had escalated the situation by bringing in a professional. She was no longer trying to convince me to move voluntarily. She was building a case for having me moved involuntarily. I invited them in because refusing would have looked like I was being uncooperative, and uncooperative was probably something Linda was trained to note on her clipboard. We sat in the living room, Linda and Sarah on the couch, me in my recliner. For the next 30 minutes, Linda asked me about my daily routine, my eating habits, my sleep patterns, my social connections, my ability to manage household tasks and personal care. I answered every question honestly and completely. She asked if I ever felt confused or disoriented. I told her no. She asked if I ever forgot to turn off appliances or lock doors. I told her no. She asked if I had fallen recently or felt unsteady on my feet. I told her no. She asked if I felt sad or depressed or isolated. I told her I felt sad sometimes because my wife had died 8 months ago, but that sadness wasn't the same thing as depression, and grief wasn't a medical condition that needed to be managed by moving me to a facility. Linda wrote things on her clipboard after each answer. I couldn't see what she was writing, but I could see Sarah watching Linda's pen move across the paper. After the questions, Linda asked if she could take a look around the house. I walked her through the house, pointing out the grab bars Ruth and I had installed in the bathrooms 3 years earlier, the improved lighting we'd added to the hallways, the non-slip mats in the tub. Linda made notes about everything. In the kitchen, she opened the refrigerator and looked at the contents. She opened a few cabinets and examined the food storage. She looked at the stove and the microwave and asked if I knew how to use all the appliances. I told her I'd been using those same appliances for 20 years. "Everything looks very well maintained," Linda said when we'd finished the tour. "You're obviously capable of managing your physical environment." I thanked her for the assessment. "But Mr. Mitchell," Linda continued, "your daughter has some valid concerns about social isolation. When did you last leave this house for a social activity?" I told her I'd had dinner with the neighbors 2 weeks ago, and I was planning to have dinner with them again this Sunday. Linda made a note. "What about medical care? When did you last see a doctor?" I told her I had an appointment with Dr. Harrison on Thursday. Linda looked surprised. She hadn't expected me to be so proactive about medical care. "Well," Linda said, closing her clipboard, "I don't see any immediate safety concerns that would warrant intervention. Mr. Mitchell appears to be managing his household and personal care adequately." Sarah's face fell. She'd brought Linda here expecting a professional assessment that would support her concerns. "However," Linda continued, and I could see Sarah's hope returning, "I would recommend regular check-ins with family members and consideration of additional support services as Mr. Mitchell ages." After they left, I sat in my recliner and thought about what had just happened. Sarah hadn't consulted me before bringing a social worker to my house. She hadn't asked my permission or explained why she thought it was necessary. She'd simply decided that my living situation needed professional evaluation and arranged for that evaluation to happen. This was an escalation, and I needed to be prepared for whatever came next. I went to the kitchen and got Ruth's blue folder from where I'd left it on the counter. The power of attorney Ruth had executed gave me complete control over all decisions related to the house. The life insurance policy and the Frank Mitchell Trust meant I had the financial resources to maintain the house for years to come. Dr. Harrison's letter documenting my physical and mental competency was recent enough to be relevant, and my appointment on Thursday would provide even more recent documentation. But it was Ruth's notebook of observations about my daily life that would be most valuable if Sarah continued to escalate. Ruth had anticipated this battle and armed me for it, not just with legal documents but with evidence that I was living exactly the kind of independent, dignified life that Sarah was trying to save me from. The phone rang. Sarah again. "Dad," she said, "I hope you're not upset about Linda coming over. We're just trying to make sure you have all the support you need." I told Sarah I wasn't upset, but I was curious about why she'd felt the need to bring a social worker to my house without discussing it with me first. "Because I was worried you'd say no," Sarah said, "and I thought it was important to get a professional opinion." "Sarah," I said, "what would have happened if Linda had found me incompetent?" There was a pause. "I don't know what you mean. If Linda had decided I couldn't take care of myself, what was your plan?" Another pause. "We would have figured out the best way to help you." "Help me how?" "By moving me to Sunset Gardens whether I wanted to go or not." "Dad, we would never force you to do anything against your will, but you brought a social worker to my house without my knowledge to assess whether I was competent to make my own decisions. That sounds like the first step in forcing me to do something against my will." Sarah was quiet for a long time. When she finally spoke, her voice was smaller, less certain. "Dad, we're scared. We're scared something will happen to you and we won't know about it until it's too late. We're scared you'll fall down the stairs or have a heart attack or just waste away from loneliness. We love you and we don't know how to protect you from all the things that could go wrong." For the first time since this whole thing started, Sarah sounded like my daughter instead of like someone trying to manage a problem. She sounded scared and sad and overwhelmed by the responsibility of caring about someone she couldn't control. "Sarah," I said, "I understand that you're scared, but being scared doesn't give you the right to make decisions about my life without consulting me. And protecting me from everything that could go wrong isn't the same as helping me live the life I want to live." After we hung up, I made myself a sandwich and sat at the kitchen table with Ruth's letter. Ruth had understood something about love that Sarah was still learning. Love wasn't about preventing all possible sources of pain or managing all potential risks. Love was about trusting someone enough to let them choose their own path, even when that path led through territory that made you uncomfortable. Sarah was trying to love me by controlling me, but Ruth had loved me by giving me the tools to remain free. Tomorrow, I would go see Dr. Harrison. This weekend, I would have dinner with Tom and Helen Patterson. And if Sarah continued to escalate this battle, I would be ready with Ruth's carefully prepared ammunition. But tonight, I would heat up another one of Ruth's casseroles and remember what it felt like to be loved by someone who trusted me to live my own life. Dr. Harrison had been our family doctor for 22 years, ever since he'd taken over the practice from old Dr. Brennan. He'd delivered Sarah's youngest child, treated Ruth through her final illness, and seen me through a minor heart episode 3 years ago that turned out to be nothing more than stress and too much coffee. He was also the kind of doctor who didn't mince words. "Frank," he said, settling into his chair across from me in the examination room, "your daughter called my office yesterday. She's concerned about your mental state." I told Dr. Harrison that I figured as much. "She seems to think you're showing signs of cognitive decline or depression that might affect your ability to live independently. She asked me to conduct a thorough evaluation and document my findings." He looked at me over his reading glasses. "How do you feel about that request?" I told him I felt like my daughter was building a case for something. Dr. Harrison nodded. "That was my impression as well. So let me ask you directly, do you feel like you're experiencing any cognitive difficulties? Memory problems, confusion, difficulty making decisions?" I told him no. "Any symptoms of depression beyond the normal grief process?" I told him no. "Any concerns about your ability to manage your daily activities?" I told him no. Dr. Harrison made notes on my chart. For the next hour, he put me through the most thorough examination I'd had in years. He checked my blood pressure, my reflexes, my coordination. He had me walk in a straight line and stand on one foot. He tested my memory by asking me to repeat sequences of numbers and recall words. He asked about my medications, my sleep patterns, my appetite, my social activities. When he was finished, Dr. Harrison sat back in his chair and looked at my chart. "Frank," he said, "you're in good health for a 72-year-old man. Your blood pressure is well controlled, your cognitive function is completely normal, and aside from some expected weight loss after Ruth's death, you show no signs of physical or mental decline." I thanked him for the thorough examination. "However," Dr. Harrison continued, "I am going to document this evaluation very carefully because I suspect you're going to need this documentation for something other than medical purposes." He was right about that. Dr. Harrison wrote a detailed letter on his official letterhead, documenting my physical and mental competency and his professional opinion that I was fully capable of making my own decisions. He gave me the original and kept a copy for his files. "When you need more documentation," Dr. Harrison said as I was leaving, "call my office. I'll be happy to provide it." That afternoon, I called Tom Patterson and asked if I could come over for a few minutes. I had something I wanted to discuss with him and Helen. We sat in their kitchen while Helen poured coffee and arranged store-bought cookies on a plate like they were something special. That was Helen's gift, making ordinary moments feel like occasions. I told them about Sarah's campaign to move me to assisted living, about the social worker visit, about my growing certainty that Sarah wasn't going to give up easily. Helen shook her head. That girl always did think she knew what was best for everyone else. I asked them if they would be willing to help me with something, and I explained what I had in mind. Tom listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair and smiled. "Ruth was a smart woman," Tom said. "She knew exactly what was coming, didn't she?" Helen asked when I wanted to do it. I told them as soon as possible. "Maybe this weekend." Helen patted my hand. "Frank," she said, "we've been neighbors for 15 years. Anyone who thinks you can't manage your own life hasn't been paying attention." Saturday morning, I woke up early and spent an hour reviewing Ruth's blue folder, making sure I understood every document. Then I called Sarah. "Sarah," I said, "I'd like you and Mike to come over for dinner tomorrow. There's something important I need to discuss with you." Sarah sounded surprised. "Of course, Dad," she said. "What time?" I told her to come around 4 o'clock. "Should we bring anything?" "Just yourselves," I said, "and maybe an open mind." Sunday afternoon, I prepared Ruth's house the same way she used to when we were expecting company. I vacuumed the living room and dusted the furniture. I set the dining room table with Ruth's good china and the cloth napkins she'd saved for special occasions. I prepared a roast with vegetables, the same meal Ruth used to make for Sunday dinners when Sarah was growing up. At 4 o'clock precisely, Sarah and Mike arrived. They seemed surprised by the formal table setting and the smell of home cooking. "Dad," Sarah said, "this is wonderful. You didn't need to go to all this trouble." I told her it wasn't trouble, it was necessary. We had dinner first, making small talk about Mike's work and Sarah's volunteer activities. Normal family conversation, the kind we used to have before Sarah had decided I needed to be managed. After we'd finished eating, I asked them to stay at the table. I went to the kitchen and retrieved Ruth's blue folder. I set it on the dining room table and opened it carefully. "Sarah," I said, 3 days after you showed me those brochures, I found something your mother had left for me. She'd hidden it behind our wedding photo, with instructions to open it only if you tried to put me somewhere I didn't want to be." Sarah's face went pale. Mike leaned forward, looking at the documents spread across the table. I showed them Ruth's letter first, reading aloud her words about the difference between caring for someone and controlling them, about love meaning trust rather than management. Sarah interrupted me. "Mom wrote this? When?" I showed her the date on the letter. 4 months before Ruth's diagnosis. Sarah stared at the letter like it was evidence of something she didn't want to believe. I continued, showing them the power of attorney that gave me complete legal control over all decisions related to the house. I explained about the life insurance policy and the Frank Mitchell Trust that ensured I'd always have the resources to maintain my independence. I showed them Dr. Harrison's letter documenting my competency, both the old one and the new one. Mike studied the documents with the attention of someone who understood legal paperwork. Sarah just stared at Ruth's letter, reading it over and over again. Finally, I showed them Ruth's notebook, the pages and pages of observations documenting my daily routines, my household management, my social connections. "Your mother," I said, "saw this conversation coming long before she got sick. She understood that you would eventually decide I couldn't take care of myself, and she prepared for that day by making sure I'd have the legal and financial resources to remain independent regardless of what you thought was best for me." Sarah looked up for Ruth's letter with tears in her eyes. "Dad," she said, "we're not trying to hurt you. We're trying to help you. I know that, Sarah. But your mother understood something that you're still learning. Help that requires me to give up my autonomy isn't help at all." Mike cleared his throat. "Frank," he said, "these documents are very thorough, but what happens when you really can't take care of yourself anymore? What happens when you need actual help?" I told Mike that when that day came, if it came, it would be my decision to make. "But what if you're not capable of making that decision?" Mike asked. "What if you have dementia or a stroke?" I showed him another document from Ruth's folder, one I hadn't mentioned yet. A healthcare directive that designated Tom Patterson as my healthcare proxy, with detailed instructions about my preferences for medical care. Sarah was crying now, not the manipulative tears that some people use to get their way, but the genuine tears of someone who was realizing that their good intentions had been misguided. "Dad," she said, "I just don't want anything bad to happen to you." "Sarah," I said gently, "bad things are going to happen to me eventually. I'm 72 years old. I'm going to get older, I'm going to get sicker, and someday I'm going to die. Those are facts, not problems that need to be solved by moving me to assisted living. I could lock myself in a padded room and be completely safe, but safety isn't the same thing as living." We sat around the dining room table for another 2 hours, talking through every concern. By the time they left, something had shifted in our relationship. Sarah was still worried about me, but she was no longer trying to manage me. She understood that her mother had prepared for this battle, and that I was armed with more than just stubbornness and sentiment. Monday morning, I woke up feeling different. Lighter somehow, like I'd been carrying a weight I hadn't realized was there until I'd set it down. I called Tom Patterson and thanked him for agreeing to serve as my healthcare proxy. "Ruth asked me to do it about 6 months before she died," Tom said. "She said she was worried about what Sarah might try to do, and she wanted to make sure you'd have an advocate who understood the difference between helping you and controlling you." I spent the morning working in Ruth's flower garden, planting the tulip bulbs she'd ordered last spring for next year's garden. She'd known she wouldn't be here to see them bloom, but she'd planted them anyway because that's what hope looks like when you're facing the end of your life. Around noon, Sarah called. "Dad," she said, "Mike and I talked about everything last night. We understand now that Mom had concerns about how we were handling this situation. We want to help you," she said, "but in the right way. What can we do that would actually be helpful instead of just making us feel better about worrying?" It was the first time Sarah had acknowledged that her efforts to help might have been more about managing her own anxiety than about addressing my actual needs. I told her that the most helpful thing she could do was trust me to know what I needed and ask before offering solutions to problems I might not actually have. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that made me realize Ruth's strategy had worked even better than she'd planned. "Dad," Sarah said, "would you be willing to teach me some of the things Mom knew? About taking care of the house, about managing things on your own. I realize I've been so focused on protecting you from having to do things yourself that I never learned how to actually do them myself." That afternoon, Sarah came over, and I taught her how to change the filter on the furnace, how to reset a tripped circuit breaker, how to maintain Ruth's flower garden. We spent 3 hours going through the house, me showing her everything Ruth had known about keeping our little ranch house running smoothly. It was the first time in months that Sarah had been in my house without trying to assess whether I was capable of living in it. That evening, I sat in my recliner and reread Ruth's letter one more time. She'd ended it with words that I was only now beginning to fully understand. "Real love," Ruth had written, "means trusting someone enough to let them choose their own path, even when that path leads through territory that makes you uncomfortable. I love you enough to give you the tools to remain free even after I'm gone." Ruth had prepared me for a battle, but more importantly, she prepared me for a life. A life where I could age with dignity in my own home, supported by people who understood the difference between helping me and managing me. I went to the kitchen and put Ruth's blue folder back in its hiding place in her sewing box. I wouldn't need those documents again. Somehow, I didn't think she would forget. Ruth's love had won a victory that would last far longer than any legal document. It had won the victory of understanding. 3 months later, on a February morning when the snow was falling thick enough to make the world look like it had been wrapped in cotton, I fell down the basement stairs. Not a dramatic tumble, nothing that would make for an interesting story at the emergency room. I'd been carrying a basket of laundry down the wooden steps when my sock slipped on the 3rd stair from the bottom. I went down hard on my left side, the laundry scattering across the concrete floor. For a few minutes, I just lay there taking inventory. My hip hurt something fierce, and my left wrist was already starting to swell. But I could move my fingers and my toes, and nothing felt broken. The problem wasn't the pain. The problem was that I couldn't get up. Every time I tried to push myself to standing, the pain in my hip would spike and my legs would refuse to cooperate. I was stuck on that cold basement floor with wet laundry scattered around me and the knowledge that this was exactly the kind of scenario Sarah had been preparing for. I lay there for maybe 10 minutes trying different positions. Nothing worked. My body had decided it was going to need help, whether my pride was ready for that or not. The medical alert device Ruth had insisted I wear was upstairs on my dresser. I could have called out for help, but the chances of anyone hearing me were slim. That left me with one option. I managed to work my cell phone out of my back pocket and called Sarah. She answered on the second ring. "Dad, what's wrong? You never call during the day." I told her I'd had a small accident and needed some help getting up. "What kind of accident? Are you hurt? Do you need an ambulance?" "I'm in the basement," I said. I slipped on the stairs. "I'm not seriously injured, but I can't get up by myself." Sarah went quiet for a moment, and I could hear her mental gears turning. This was it. This was the phone call she'd been expecting for months, the emergency that would prove she'd been right all along about me living alone. "I'll be right there," Sarah said. "Don't try to move until I get there." 20 minutes later, I heard Sarah's key in the front door lock. "Dad," she called, "where are you?" "In the basement," I called back, "at the bottom of the stairs." I heard her footsteps on the floor above, quick and purposeful. Then she was coming down the stairs, moving carefully but efficiently. Sarah took one look at me sprawled on the basement floor and did something I didn't expect. She didn't panic. She didn't lecture me or remind me that this was exactly what she'd been worried about. She sat down on the bottom step and assessed the situation like someone who'd been trained for emergencies. "Where does it hurt?" she asked. I told her about my hip and my wrist. "Can you move your legs, your arms?" I demonstrated that everything still worked, just not well enough to get me vertical. "Okay," Sarah said, "let's figure out how to get you up without making anything worse." For the next 10 minutes, Sarah helped me work through different strategies for standing. She brought down a kitchen chair to use as support. She cleared the scattered laundry out of the way. She positioned herself where she could help bear some of my weight. Finally, with Sarah's help and a lot of careful maneuvering, I managed to get upright. "How do you feel?" Sarah asked. "Like an old man who fell down some stairs," I said, "but nothing's broken." Sarah helped me up the basement stairs, one step at a time, her hand on my elbow. When we reached the kitchen, she guided me to a chair at the table and went to get ice for my wrist. "Dad," she said, settling into the chair across from me, "we need to talk about what just happened." Here it comes, I thought. The conversation about how this proved I couldn't live alone. But that's not what Sarah said. Instead, she asked me why I'd been carrying a full laundry basket down the stairs instead of taking the clothes down in smaller loads. I told her I'd always carried the full basket down. Sarah nodded. "Mom was 20 years younger than you are now when you developed that system. Maybe it's time to modify it." She wasn't talking about moving me out of the house. She was talking about modifying my routines to make them safer. "What would you suggest?" I asked. Sarah thought for a moment. "What if you install the laundry chute?" she asked. "Something that would let you drop clothes directly into a basket in the basement without having to carry them down the stairs?" It was a practical suggestion, the kind of modification that would solve the immediate problem without requiring me to give up my independence. We spent the next hour talking through other potential safety improvements. Better lighting in the basement, a handrail on both sides of the stairs, non-slip treads on the wooden steps. Then she did something that surprised me even more. "Dad," she said, "I think you should call Dr. Harrison and get checked out, just to make sure you don't have any injuries that aren't obvious yet." I told her I felt fine, just sore. "I know," Sarah said, "but humor me. Part of living independently is being proactive about medical care when something happens." She was right, of course, and more importantly, she was treating the accident as an opportunity to improve my safety systems rather than as evidence that I needed to abandon my independence. Dr. Harrison's office could see me that afternoon. Sarah offered to drive me, and I accepted. In the car, Sarah talked about the modifications we'd discussed, about which ones would be most important to implement first. It was the kind of conversation Ruth and I used to have when we were planning home improvements. Practical, focused on problem solving, based on the assumption that the house was our permanent home. Dr. Harrison examined me thoroughly and confirmed what I'd suspected. Bruised hip, sprained wrist, nothing that wouldn't heal with time. But he also said something that stayed with me. "Frank," Dr. Harrison said, "the fact that you could assess your own condition accurately and seek appropriate help shows good judgment and self-awareness. Those are exactly the qualities you need to continue living independently." On the drive home, Sarah was quiet for a long time. Finally, she said something that made me realize how much our relationship had changed. "Dad," she said, "I'm proud of how you handled today. You recognized that you needed help, you asked for it appropriately, and you took practical steps to address what happened. That's not the behavior of someone who can't take care of himself." That evening, after Sarah had gone home, I sat in my recliner with an ice pack on my wrist and thought about the test I'd just passed. Because that's what the accident had been, really. A test of whether the systems Ruth had put in place would work. A test of whether Sarah had really learned the lesson about the difference between helping me and controlling me. A test of whether I could handle a crisis without losing my independence. I'd passed the test. More importantly, Sarah had passed it too. Instead of using my accident as ammunition in her campaign, she'd used it as an opportunity to help me modify my living situation to make it safer. Instead of treating my fall as evidence that I couldn't take care of myself, she'd recognized it as a normal consequence of aging. Instead of panicking or lecturing, she'd helped me solve the immediate problem. Ruth would have been proud of both of us. Over the next 2 weeks, Sarah coordinated the installation of safety modifications throughout the house. Better lighting, handrails on both sides of the basement stairs, non-slip treads, and a simple laundry chute. She researched contractors, got quotes, and supervised the installations. More importantly, she treated every modification as an improvement to my home rather than as evidence that I needed a different home. When the work was finished, Sarah and I walked through the house together, checking each modification. In the basement, standing at the bottom of the stairs where I'd fallen, Sarah said something that made me understand how completely she'd internalized Ruth's lesson. "Dad," she said, "these modifications don't make you dependent. They make you more independent. They give you the tools to keep living the way you want to live." That night, I took Ruth's letter out of the blue folder and read it one more time. Her words about real love meaning trust, about the difference between helping someone and controlling them, about giving people the tools to remain free. The accident had been a test, but it had also been an opportunity. An opportunity for Sarah to demonstrate that she'd learned to help me in ways that supported my independence rather than undermining it. An opportunity for me to prove that I could handle crises appropriately. An opportunity for both of us to honor Ruth's wisdom about what love really looks like when it's tested. I folded the letter carefully and put it back in the blue folder. I had a feeling I wouldn't need to read it again. Its lessons had been learned, its wisdom had been tested, and its promise had been fulfilled. Ruth's love had prepared me not just for the battle with Sarah, but for the ongoing challenge of aging with dignity in my own home. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The world looked clean and quiet, covered in a blanket that would melt in a few days, leaving behind the promise of spring. Inside, my house felt solid and safe, modified for my changing needs, but still fundamentally mine. Still the place where Ruth and I had built a life together. The medical alert device sat on my dresser where I'd left it. Tomorrow, I would remember to wear it. Not because Sarah had lectured me about it, but because wearing it was a practical way to ensure that if I needed help again, I could get it quickly. Ruth had been right about everything, about Sarah's good intentions and misguided methods, about the importance of preparing for battles before they began, about the difference between love that controls and love that trusts. Most importantly, she'd been right about the kind of love that outlasts death and continues to protect the people we care about long after we're gone. That was the love that had prepared me for this test, and that was the love that would carry me through whatever tests were still to come. 1 year later, I was sitting in Ruth's garden on the first warm day of spring, watching the tulips she'd planted bloom in colors she'd never see, when Sarah pulled into my driveway with a car full of teenagers. It was Saturday afternoon, and she'd brought Jessica and 3 of her college friends home for the weekend. They spilled out of the car carrying backpacks and laughing about something that had happened during the drive, the way young people do when the world still feels full of possibilities. "Grandpa Frank," Jessica called, running across the yard to give me a hug. "The tulips are gorgeous. Did you plant these?" I told her that her grandmother had planted them the spring before she died, planting a garden she'd never get to enjoy but knew someone else would. Jessica looked around the yard, taking in the modifications Sarah and I had made over the past year. The improved pathway lighting, the raised flower beds that were easier for me to maintain, the small greenhouse where I'd started growing vegetables year-round. "This place looks amazing," Jessica said. "Mom told me about all the improvements you've been making." Sarah walked over from where she'd been helping her friends unload their bags. She'd kept her promise from that day in the basement, treating every modification to the house as an investment in my continued independence rather than evidence that I needed to be somewhere else. Over the past year, Sarah had become my project manager, finding solutions to challenges I hadn't even realized I was facing. But she'd never once suggested that these challenges meant I should move somewhere else. "Dad," Sarah said, "the girls were hoping you'd tell them the story about Mom's instructions. Jessica's been bragging to her friends about her grandfather who outsmarted the family conspiracy to put him in a nursing home." I laughed. "I wasn't sure it was much of a conspiracy," I said, "more like a well-meaning misunderstanding." But I invited them all to sit down, and I told them about finding Ruth's envelope behind the wedding photo, about the blue folder full of legal documents and evidence, about the difference between loving someone by trying to control them and loving someone by giving them the tools to remain free. Jessica's friends listened with the kind of attention young people usually reserve for stories about adventure and romance. To them, the idea of fighting for your independence in old age probably seemed as exotic as fighting pirates or climbing mountains. One of them, a serious-looking girl named Amanda, asked me if I'd been scared when I realized what Sarah was trying to do. I told her I'd been more confused than scared. I hadn't understood initially that Sarah's concerns came from love rather than doubt about my competency. "But weren't you angry?" Amanda asked. "That she was trying to make decisions about your life without asking you?" I looked at Sarah, who was sitting quietly, letting me tell the story without trying to defend herself. "I was frustrated," I said. "But anger and frustration are temporary feelings. Understanding lasts longer and serves you better." Jessica asked what I thought was the most important thing I'd learned from the whole experience. "The most important thing," I said, "was that your grandmother understood something about love that it took me longer to learn. Love isn't about preventing all possible harm from coming to someone you care about. Love is about giving them the resources they need to handle whatever harm does come their way." After the girls went inside to get settled, Sarah and I sat in the garden. "Dad," Sarah said, "I need to apologize to you again, not just for what I tried to do, but for why I tried to do it. I was so focused on managing my own anxiety about losing you that I almost lost sight of what you actually needed from me." "Sarah," I said, "you learned the lesson your mother was trying to teach. That's what matters." "But I almost didn't learn it," Sarah said. "I was so convinced I knew what was best for you that I couldn't hear what you were actually telling me about what you wanted." We sat quietly for a while, watching the bees work Ruth's flowers. It was the kind of peaceful afternoon that Ruth had loved. Sarah asked me something I'd been wondering about myself. "Dad, do you think Mom knew she was going to die when she set up all those legal arrangements?" I told her I thought Ruth had understood that she might die before I did, and she'd wanted to make sure I'd be prepared. But more than that, she knew that adult children sometimes confuse their need to feel useful with their parents' need for help. Sarah nodded. She was smarter about people than I am. That evening, after Jessica and her friends had gone out for dinner and Sarah had driven home, I sat in my recliner with Ruth's blue folder in my lap. I'd taken it out not because I needed to review the documents, but because I wanted to read her letter one more time on the anniversary of finding it. Her words had taken on new meaning. What had seemed like preparation for a battle now felt more like guidance for a journey. Ruth had known that aging would bring challenges, but she'd also known that challenges weren't the same thing as defeat. She'd understood that accepting help wasn't the same thing as giving up independence, that modifying your life wasn't the same thing as surrendering it. Most importantly, she understood that the people who love you will sometimes try to protect you in ways that end up hurting you, and she'd given me the tools to protect myself from that kind of love without rejecting the people offering it. I read her postscript about the casserole again and realized I'd been taking her advice about more than just food. Whenever I felt overwhelmed, I'd found something simple and comforting to focus on. A warm meal, a tidy room, a well-maintained garden. Ruth had understood that dignity wasn't about never needing help. Dignity was about being able to choose what kind of help you accepted and from whom you accepted it. The next morning, I woke up to find Tom Patterson in my kitchen, making coffee and reading my newspaper like he'd been doing it for years. "Morning, Frank," Tom said. "Helen sent me over with some of her cinnamon rolls, and I figured I'd get the coffee started while I was at it." This had become Tom's routine over the past year. Every Sunday morning, he'd come over with something Helen had baked, and we'd drink coffee and solve the world's problems while reading the paper together. It wasn't the kind of help Sarah had originally tried to arrange. It was just the kind of neighborly support that happens naturally when people care about each other and trust each other to know what they need. Tom poured 2 cups of coffee and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. "Helen and I were talking last night," Tom said, "about how much you've accomplished this past year. The house improvements, the garden expansion, the way you've handled everything that's come up. I told Tom that I'd had good help and good advice." Tom nodded. Ruth knew what she was doing when she set up all those arrangements. "But Frank, the arrangements were just tools. What you did with them was up to you." We spent the morning going through the newspaper section by section, arguing about politics and sports and the state of the world in general. It was the kind of comfortable conversation that happens between men who've known each other long enough to disagree without taking offense. Around noon, Helen called to invite me for Sunday dinner. She was making fried chicken, she said, and she'd made too much for just her and Tom. This was Helen's fiction. She never made too much food accidentally. But it was her way of ensuring I had a home-cooked meal and company for Sunday dinner without making it seem like charity. Over dinner, Tom and Helen asked about my plans for the coming year. I told them I was thinking about converting part of the garage into a woodworking shop. I'd always enjoyed making things with my hands. Helen asked if that was something I'd discussed with Sarah. I told her I'd mentioned it, and Sarah had immediately started researching contractors and equipment suppliers who sold woodworking tools designed for people with arthritis. Tom laughed. "That girl has really learned how to help instead of how to manage." After dinner, I walked home through the neighborhood where I'd lived for 30 years. But the neighborhood felt different now. Not because it had changed, but because my place in it had changed. I was no longer part of a couple maintaining a household together. I was a widower maintaining his independence with the help of people who respected his right to make his own choices. That evening, I called Sarah to thank her for bringing Jessica and her friends by. "Dad," Sarah said, "I'm glad they got to hear that story. Jessica's been telling everyone about how her grandfather fought the system and won. I told Sarah that I wasn't sure I'd won anything. I just figured out how to age on my own terms with help from people who understood the difference between supporting me and controlling me." "You did win," Sarah said. "You won the right to live your own life. And maybe more importantly, you taught me how to love someone without trying to manage them." After we hung up, I sat in Ruth's chair by the bedroom window and looked out at the garden we planted together. The garden was both hers and mine now, a collaboration that continued even though one of the collaborators was gone. Like the house itself, like the life I was building in her absence, it was rooted in what we'd created together but growing in directions she'd never see. That was what Ruth's instructions had really been about. Not just preparation for a specific battle with Sarah, but guidance for the larger challenge of continuing to live authentically after the person who knew you best was gone. She'd given me the legal tools to protect my independence, but more importantly, she'd given me the emotional tools to maintain my dignity while accepting the help I needed. "Real love," Ruth had written, "means trusting someone enough to let them choose their own path." She'd trusted me to choose a path that honored both our life together and my life without her. She'd trusted me to use her gifts wisely and to build relationships that supported my independence rather than undermining it. A year later, sitting in our bedroom as darkness settled over the neighborhood, I could say with confidence that her trust had been well placed. I was 73 years old, living alone in a house that had been modified to support my changing needs but remained fundamentally mine. I had family relationships based on mutual respect rather than management. I had neighbor friends who provided support without supervision. I had medical care that treated me as a competent adult. I had, in other words, exactly what Ruth's instructions had been designed to secure for me, the tools to remain free. Tomorrow, I would wake up in my own bed, make coffee in my own kitchen, and tend flowers in my own garden. I would read the newspaper with Tom Patterson and call my daughter to check on her family. I would live another day of the life Ruth had loved me enough to protect, even after she was no longer there to share it with me. The house settled around me with the familiar sounds of home. Outside, the spring night was full of the quiet activity of growing things. Inside, I was surrounded by 48 years of memories, and whatever years remained to create new ones. I was exactly where I belonged, living exactly the life I'd chosen, protected by love that trusted rather than controlled. Ruth's instructions had worked perfectly. Not because they prevented all possible problems, but because they'd given me the resources to handle whatever problems came my way while remaining the person I'd always been. That was what real love looked like. That was what a legacy worth leaving looked like. That was what home felt like when it was protected by someone who understood that the best way to take care of the people you love is to make sure they can take care of themselves. I hope this story has resonated with those of you who've navigated the complex territory between caring for aging family members and respecting their independence. There's profound wisdom in understanding that the people we love most deserve our trust as much as our protection, and that real help empowers rather than diminishes. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from around the world. I'm always moved by how these stories about family, love, and the courage to age with dignity connect people across different countries and cultures. You might find someone from your own community sharing their experiences in the comments. It's beautiful how these universal themes create connections between strangers. If this story touched something in you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about family dynamics, the meaning of true love, and the strength we find when we choose to honor both our relationships and our independence. Sometimes the most loving thing we can do is trust the people we care about to know what's best for their own lives. Until next time, remember that growing older doesn't mean growing smaller. Your life is yours to live, and the people who truly love you will want to help you live it on your own terms.